Hi everyone, I'll now be going through the TE for reproduction. First question, which of the following is not a feature of double fertilization? Okay, so which area of this chapter is this question asking? Double fertilization, you're referring to plant reproduction. And in plant reproduction, one of the key differences compared to human repro is that fertilization takes place twice. So let's look through all the options, which one best describes or does not describe. It says that which is not a feature, that means one of them is not a feature and three are. Number one, generative nucleus undergoes meiosis to form two sperm nuclei. This is not true. Well, it seems like it's true. Actually, the area that's wrong is this statement over here. It is mitosis. You may be wondering, how can a cell undergo mitosis to form sperms? Well, actually in plants, how sperms are formed is a bit different. Meiosis happens way before the generative nucleus exists. So rather, a generative nucleus is formed as a result of meiosis. Therefore, the generative nucleus is already haploid from its starting point because it was formed through meiosis. The generative cell then undergoes mitosis to form two sperm nuclei. Both of them are haploid. So the key thing to take note here is the meiosis part. It's actually mitosis. B. One sperm nucleus fertilizes the egg cell while the other fuses with the polar nuclei. This is a correct statement, hence the word double fertilization, because two things are being fertilized, egg cell and polar nuclei. C. Pollen tube secretes hydrolytic enzymes to digest surrounding tissues in a style. Where's the style? This is the stigma, and the pollen grain lands here, and the pollen tube grows out. The style, this being the pollen tube, the style is this long connective part that connects to the stigma, that eventually connects to the ovary. D. The stigma secretes a sugary solution which acts as a stimulus for the pollen grain to produce pollen tube, and that is also true. So the best answer is A. Which row shows the effects of estrogen and progesterone? Okay, the best answer here is A. For ovulation to take place, you do need a high level of estrogen. Why? Because a high level of estrogen will then cause a surge in the LH and FSH, which will result in ovulation. Whereas before that, at low levels of estrogen, actually it prevents the development of more follicles because there is a negative inhibition of FSH when levels are low. So it seems counterintuitive, but actually they employ different pathways. That's why estrogen at low levels can result in negative inhibition, at high levels can result in positive feedback. High levels needed to prevent secretion of FSH. Okay, it's true, progesterone combined with estrogen after ovulation will result in the inhibition and prevention of more FSH being secreted. Last but not least, progesterone is also required to maintain the uterine lining. The diagram that will be very useful for you to remember is this particular diagram below. So this graph over here. This graph helps you understand, or rather you need to understand this graph so that you'll be able to answer the question above. So for example, at low levels of estrogen, there's actually a negative inhibition resulting in also low levels of FSH and LH. But as estrogen levels increase, it also causes a surge in FSH and LH. And earlier on, they also say progesterone is required to negatively inhibit the production of FSH and LH. It is also required for the maintenance of the uterine lining. Let's now go back to the MCQ. Let's go to question 3. Which of the following diagram? Okay, the following diagram shows a simplified drawing of a female reproductive system. Which alphabet indicates the location where fertilization of the egg takes place? Fertilization of the egg takes place at B. One might think it takes place at A, but actually that's a bit too late. It actually takes place at B, fertilization. After that, it already starts to develop and grow into a blastocyst, which is a ball of cells and then it will embed itself in the uterine lining after developing into a blastocyst. So B is the answer. Next, 4. Which of the following is not a function of the placenta? That means 3 of them are functions of the placenta. A. Ensures that the fetal blood system is separate from the mother's one. That is correct. B. Allows diffusion of nutrients and removal of waste substances to and fro from the fetus. That's also true. C. Produces estrogen and progesterone. That is also true. D. Supports and cushions the fetus from mechanic shock. That's not true. The structure that's responsible for that is the amniotic fluid. Right, the amniotic fluid, or this is what is also referred to as water bag. When you say water bag burst, the amniotic fluid is the thing that cushions. It is made up of a lot of water, and it helps to cushion any impact so that it doesn't directly hit the baby. Next, 5. The following diagram shows a cross-section of the male repro system. Which of the following will happen if structure X is removed from the body? Structure X refers to the epididymis. So the epididymis is where sperms will go to fully mature. If you remove this part, sperms will not be able to fully mature. And if they cannot fully mature, they will not be able to develop their tails to be able to swim. So C is the answer. It's not that sperms will not be produced. Sperms are produced at the testicles, so it will be produced, just they won't fully mature. Testosterone cannot be produced. The epididymis is not where testosterone is produced. It's instead produced at the testicles. D. The volume of semen will be less. Okay, that's not true. You will still produce sperms, so the volume should remain the same, just that these sperms are unviable. They are unable to swim. Let's go to the structured question. In this structured question, they give you a case study. They say that there's this tree in the North American continent, and this tree is able to reproduce through a form of vegetative propagation, which is a form of asexual reproduction. So this question is really trying to see your understanding of the asexual reproduction. What are the benefits, what are the advantages or the disadvantages, when one might want to use it, and when this may not be used. So they also say that the aspen tree can reproduce sexually also. So this is interesting. The tree can reproduce both asexually and sexually. So question A. Explain with reference to a type of nuclear division. There are 2 types, mitosis and meiosis. Why a patch of aspen trees is known as a clone. Okay, so a patch of aspen tree produced through vegetative propagation, we often call it a clone. A clone is something that is identical. But not just identical, it is genetically identical. And in order to produce genetically identical cells, we cannot make use of meiosis, it has to be mitosis. So those are the 2 marking points. First one, we are looking to see if you can say that all the trees who have been produced asexually through mitosis, and that they will be genetically identical to each other. Next, suggest why it may be advantageous for aspen to reproduce via asexual means rather than sexually. So you can find this in a table in your textbook that shares with you the various advantages of asexual repro. One of the advantages is that when you reproduce this way, all your offspring will be genetically identical. And it is good if and only the parent plant is well adapted to its existing environment. If it's already well adapted, that means all the offspring will also be able to survive well in this environment. Asexual reproduction is also much faster, it's very rapid. So this can result in a rapid increase in numbers very fast. Okay, these are 2 advantages. You may also find several more advantages in your textbook. C. Suggest the circumstances under which the aspen will choose to reproduce sexually via rather than via asexual means. So this question is really asking you, when will sexual reproduction be an advantage? Or another way you could answer this is, when will asexual reproduction be a disadvantage? So let's have a look. So the first few points share about how sexual reproduction could be an advantage. First advantage is that if you reproduce sexually, when the environment around is changing, this will result in greater genetic variation. And this greater genetic variation will mean a better chance of survival of the offspring in the new environment. Because if you have a population of organisms, each one slightly different from each other, the chances that some of these organisms are adapted to the changing environment will be higher. That will allow a better chance that the overall population will survive to the next generation. But if everyone is exactly the same, and a virus, for example, comes and infects the trees, everyone will be equally vulnerable. So variety is good. So the last point argues the other way. In asexual reproduction or vegetative propagation, because all the offspring are genetically identical, it's very easy for all of them to be wiped out if they are not adapted to the new environment. Let's go to question 2. Question 2 shows you a flower, and they want you to be able to first identify the parts. So P is the anther, Q is the ovule, S is the receptacle. Receptacle is the connective tissue over here that connects the stem of the plant to the ovary of the flower. Ovary meaning this part over here. R is the sepal. Sepals are these leaves over here. Next, they say dioecious plants have male and female reproductive parts on different plants, whereas monoecious plants have both male and female parts on the same plant. So if you look at this particular flower, can you tell whether this flower came from a plant that is monoecious or dioecious? Based on the definition given to you, this plant is monoecious because you can find both male parts, which are these anthers with the filaments. You also find the stigma with the ovary and the ovules. That means this plant has both male and female parts on the same, male and female reproductive parts on the same plant. After all, it's already found on the same flower. They ask you to indicate on figure 2 with an X to indicate where the pollen is deposited. So it's deposited on the stigma, so this is where you should put it, X. Shade on figure 2 the structures that have the capacity to develop into a seed. So you should shade all of the ovules. Each ovule can develop into a seed. This flower, therefore, this ovary over here, would have 6 seeds at the end of the day. Let's go to the next question. EI, predict the likely mode of pollination for this flower. Likely it is insect pollinated. And then they'll ask you to state one feature that supports your prediction. There are many things you could say. Number 1, you can say that there are nectar guides on the petals. The nectar guides are over here. You see these lines? These are nectar guides. Next, you can say that they have large petals relative to the flower. Okay, we cannot tell if these petals are really that large because we have no sense of scale. But at least when you look at the petals relative to the flower, it is quite large. Okay, but for all we know, this flower could be quite microscopic lah. Okay, next, stamen and stigma surrounded by petals. Okay, stamen is the male part, stigma is the female part, surrounded by the petals. Usually, if the stamen and stigma are surrounded by the petals, it is an indication that it's insect pollinated. Because if it's going to be wind pollinated, you want all these parts to be out in the wind, not wrapped up in petals. Last but not least, the stigma is small and compact. So you look over here, stigma is small and compact. If it's wind pollinated, you expect the stigma to be longer, sticking out, so they can capture the pollen grain in the wind. I'd like to point out that when it asks you for a feature that supports the prediction, you shouldn't be sharing about features that cannot be seen here. So for example, don't say stamens are not pendulous, or that the stigma is not feathery, or does not protrude. These are not things we can see, so instead we want to focus on the things that we can see, right? Rather than say things that are absent. You could say all these features. You could say if we provide you a flower that's pendulous, that's feathery stigma, that protrudes out, those are features that you can use to describe a wind-pollinated flower. Okay, third part, state 2 features not shown in figure 2 that will support your prediction. So what can you not see but will also help in insect pollination? If it is scented, if there's nectar as a reward. The pollen grains also you cannot really see, but usually they're large and sticky. And the stigma is sticky, so they can catch the pollen grains. I like to point out that when we say scented, it need not be nice smelling. It could be bad smelling also. Both could attract pollinators. F. Many flowers have developed various mechanisms to promote cross-fertilization. They ask you first to define cross-fertilization. It's important that in cross-fertilization, you need to say that one of the egg from one plant fertilized by the sperm cell from a different plant. Then it's complete. Okay, so you need to show an indication that you know it's from different plant. Next, explain briefly how cross-fertilization may be advantageous over self-fertilization. This relates a bit to earlier on about genetic variation. In cross-fertilization, you will increase genetic variation. That's because both sperm and the egg are varied to begin with. And putting them together, fusing together, you end up with a zygote that's even more varied. Okay, as compared to self-fertilization, it has limited genetic variation. It's not that there is no genetic variation, there is limited. I say that you cannot say that there's no genetic variation. It's because, let's say you have a pollen grain from a flower that lands on its own stigma, fertilizes its own egg. That is also possible. But remember that the sperm and the egg will also be varied because of meiosis. Meiosis that's crossing over all the stuff. So there will still be genetic variation, but not as varied as if you get a sperm or egg from a different plant altogether. Okay, why is genetic variation good? So that there's greater adaptability, higher chance of survival in an environment that's changing. 3. Suggest with elaboration a mechanism which flower figure 2 may employ to promote cross-fertilization. So you could say protoandry or protogyny. Protoandry means that the anthers mature before the female parts do. Protogyny means that the stigmas mature first. So these are processes that can help in cross-fertilization. Another one that kind of prevents cross-fertilization from taking place are those chemical in nature. So you may find in your textbook the word self-incompatibility. This is one way that the plant is able to prevent pollen grains from itself from fertilizing its own egg. Because the moment a pollen grain lands on a stigma, it will not be able to grow a pollen tube. Okay, that is self-incompatibility. Next, we look at question 3. Shows you the levels of FSH and LH in the blood of an adult female. Here's the graph. Okay, this graph, if you look at it, it looks a little different from the graph that we are familiar with over here. Okay, what is similar? For example, you see that FSH, the levels kind of started off a little bit high over here. Okay, and then it kind of dipped, went on a downward slope later on. And then it increased again. That's FSH. You find for LH, you find that there is a gradual increase, and then there's a sharp increase. Okay, so that's what we learned. This graph also kind of shows that on the left-hand side. You see that for FSH, it increases, and then it starts off a bit high, and then it starts to dip down, but then it increases again. For LH, it increases gradually, and then there's a sharp increase. Okay, so They ask you first, with reference to the graph, so you must make reference to values, describe and explain the changes in FSH and LH levels from start until ovulation. So let's separate this answer into a few parts. First, let's talk about 0 to 5. Then after that, 5 to around 9. Then after that, 9 to over here, where ovulation will occur. So from 0 to 5, you see that there's a gradual increase in FSH and LH. And then you want to quote some values. So how do we explain this? Why is there a gradual increase? There's a gradual increase because it's being secreted by the anterior pituitary gland, which is not currently inhibited by anything yet. However, once FSH and LH is being secreted, we start producing follicles. Follicles start developing. Here, as you see on the right hand side. As the follicles develop, it will start to produce estrogen. And estrogen is very interesting because estrogen will start to negatively inhibit the secretion of any more FSH or LH. So if you look at day 5 to 9, you see the FSH levels start to decrease. This happens because when estrogen starts to be secreted at low levels, it will exert a negative feedback on the FSH secretion to keep the secretion low. Then you look at days 9 to 13, you see a sharp increase in FSH and LH. This sharp increase is because there is an accumulation of estrogen secreted by the follicles that are growing. And the accumulated estrogen will exert a positive feedback on the FSH and LH secretion, resulting in a sharp increase. Eventually, ovulation will occur because of the surge in LH. So this is many points. This is kind of like an essay question, but it relates back to this graph that we expect you to know. Next, let's look at part B. If females were to take oral contraceptive pills, predict and explain what types of hormones these pills would typically contain. You should expect them to contain estrogen and progesterone, because these two hormones are able to exert a negative feedback on FSH and LH secretion. Why is it important to exert a negative feedback on these two? Because this results in the development of follicles, which is where the eggs are developing, and this results in the ovulation. So if we can artificially result in more estrogen and more progesterone, we are trying to mimic this part over here. See this region over here where there's a lot of progesterone and estrogen? We're trying to mimic this part so that there'll be a negative inhibition on the two hormones above. Then we can prevent more follicles from developing and no more ovulation. And then this will result in, if there's no ovulation, you will not be any egg for fertilization to take place. Why not inject FSH? Why not consume FSH or LH? Because actually FSH stimulates more follicles develop. LH will stimulate ovulation. If you take these two in, on the contrary, it will help promote development of follicles and promote ovulation. More eggs, more chances of fertilization. Let's go to the last question. State and explain how the features of the sperm aid in its function. They're asking you to describe the structure and adaptation of a sperm. A sperm comes with, number one, this vesicle region at the head called an acrosome. The acrosome is where, so point over here, the acrosome contains a lot of hydrolytic enzymes that help to break down the zona pellucida surrounding the egg. Next, the sperm cell also comes with a nucleus, and this nucleus contains haploid number of chromosomes, so that when it fuses, it can form a diploid zygote. So nucleus, haploid chromosomes, so they can fuse with the egg. Next, the sperm also comes with a lot of mitochondria. This mitochondria is important so that ATP can be synthesized, so that this tail region can do its part to propel the sperms. So mitochondria generate ATP so that sperms can have energy to swim. Last but not least, you can make mention to the tail itself. The tail is necessary to propel the sperm. Right? So these are the points. You can also have a review, have a check through all these learning outcomes, see if the questions have helped you check whether you understand these learning outcomes. If you have any more questions, feel free to contact me privately.